David Kirichenko is one of the sharper voices reporting on Ukraine's war, especially where warfare is changing drones, cyber, robotics. He blends vivid frontline storytelling with policy and strategic insight, especially how Ukraine's innovations force changes in how nations are going to be fighting in the future. But it's not just that. It's not just about the equipment. He places the moral stakes at the center, not just victory, but the battle for memory, for justice, and identity. And if you're not following his work, I suggest you do, because he has one of the most insightful, well-informed, and rounded voices that help to oppose Russia's lies and aggression. David, welcome.
Thank you.
Well, let's dive into a bunch of topics. We are going to talk about drones and warfare, but you do a particular kind of reporting. You're not obviously flitting in and out. You're not putting a flak jacket on and then reporting from the roof of a nice hotel in central Kiev. You're there immersing yourself. And I think you've talked about how immersive reporting is critical. Why is it important to you? And what is the quality of insight that it adds to your work?
Yeah, I mean, why it's important to me? I'm the son of Ukrainian refugees, religious refugees from the Soviet Union. My family were Protestants, and they were heavily persecuted for their faith. And my great grandfather fought in World War One and was captured and put into a POW camp. And he was converted to become a Protestant. And when he returned to Ukraine, he was later executed by the Soviets. My grandparents survived the genocide in the 1930s, the Holodomor, and when the Germans came, my grandfather was put into a German camp. My grandmother ran away into the forest. After the war, he wanted to go home to his family, even though the Americans liberated the camp. Then the Russians put him in a camp right after he came back to Ukraine. And so, my family has fought in even the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. I had, I believe, a great uncle that died in the Russo-Finnish War. Family that fought in World War One, World War Two, the Soviet-Afghan War. Just our family never wanted to be a part of these wars, but they were forced to fight on behalf of Russia. And they have killed us and tried to destroy our identity for hundreds of years. So it was something I was very aware of as a child, and always knew that I would have some sort of role to play in helping my people. And um, in terms of the frontline reporting experience, I think it great. It's like a business. The closer that you are to the customer, the more that you actually understand what the real problems are. And very often I find each time that I go to the front line, I see the changing trends and just patterns of the war change much faster than a lot of analysts or commentators frequently keep up with, because the pace of innovation is only increasing. We also just hear that, like, the day-to-day problems that soldiers are facing and how that's impacting the battlefield. And so for me, it's really important to be able to get a very clear view on just the problems, what's going well, what's not going well, to inform my reporting and the insights that I can give out. And I go by myself, as essentially as a freelancer. So no translators, no one guiding me. Just I go out there and find contacts and get myself to the front. This last time I had to get a rental car and drive with, like, no GPS working, just in the middle of the night, driving out to meet some soldiers to go on a embedded mission. But then just there's an incredible amount of skin in the game. There's no organization that's going to evacuate me if we get hit by a drone when we're driving through the kill zone. I'm not a soldier, so I'm not going to be put into a military hospital. There's almost no reward for putting so much skin in the game to get yourself into the front line and go on those missions to see what it's like on the front itself.
And you've not got a gold-plated insurance policy, I imagine, as well, because large media organizations pay for their journalists, but then often don't allow them to go where the significant story is. Is there a sense then that you have a Kiev reality of the war? And I'm being crude here, but then you have a reality that you can only discover through strong and close interaction with those who are actually doing the fighting, and not just soldiery in the trenches, but actually being able to speak to commanders and people who have, dare I say it, a sort of strategic way of analyzing what's going on. And is this a real challenge? Because, of course, some Western military analysts and indeed political analysts and politicians themselves maybe will be getting the Kiev reality, not the reality of, say, some key commanders.
Yeah, I mean that's very much I think is what is happening often when I find myself back in the cities, whether it's Kyiv or Dnipro, and you talk to people outside or even analysts that like live in those cities. It's a very different experience. For many of like what they're hearing, and a lot of them rely on stories that are being told by other people or information passed down through some Telegram channel. And very often I find that like that's does not align with what what's actually happening on the front line. And so in those cities themselves, you have to contend with a lot of, I think, misinformation, people just being flooded with information from many different channels. And so just the commanders, the soldiers that are on the front line, and being able to share that experience with them, you just cut through all the noise and see what's really happening.
I'd also say to the audience, we're going to have a little clip in here from the 93rd Brigade. They desperately need trucks. So please, when that clip comes up, do have a look at it, follow the links. And if you're able to help, they're in desperate need of trucks that will help actually save lives and keep Ukraine resilient.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні! Героям слава!
And the other challenge there, isn't it, of course, is the progress of military reform, tackling, again, what I crudely would term remnants of the Soviet hierarchical thinking, which is a blocker to innovation. What's your impression then on how that struggle's going? And those units that have shown themselves to be highly innovative, what are the challenges in them sharing and propagating that across to other battalions and units?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example of that is if we even think about Ukraine's current drone chief boss, or the Hartier Brigade, or the Third Assault Brigade, other brigades that I spent time with, a lot of their success came from their commanders coming from like being entrepreneurs or having a business background. Because you treat, it being a tech war, it also means that you need to have resources, you need to have R&D investment, the soldiers need to be well equipped, and that means you need a constant flow of money. And it even goes down to some of the really small, minute details. But if we think about Twitter videos or social media videos, and how at the start of the war, some of the brigades and soldiers saw there was so much interest, so they're putting out like these videos on Facebook or Twitter. They're generating views, donations are coming in, and so they're like, okay, we need to have a good social media and a PR strategy so that we get views that translates into money. That means our drone units and soldiers are more well equipped, and so it's like building out this whole ecosystem of like managing a business and getting the units to be well resourced. And so, some of the top brigades now are the ones that have the most visibility, or the ones that have treated war like a business. figuring out what works, what doesn't work, optimizing some of the other brigades, or especially the newer brigades, or territorial brigades. They're certainly struggling with matching the output and the resources. So you definitely have varying levels between some of the brigades. And in terms of the Soviet era reform, there's certainly aspects of, I think under Sursky, but again, even between the commanders and soldiers, the view is so muddied. But I think the struggle has been reverting back to some of like the Soviet ways of fighting, and it's not to Ukraine's advantage to treat it like a small Soviet army fighting a much bigger Soviet army, I think, in the words of Zaluzhny. So reforms have been progressing, but still there's like layers of the military that are not absorbing all the lessons, and reforms. So from my understanding is certainly members of the general staff understand very high level issues, and they're trying to drive that change. And a lot of it is coming from the ground up, from the commanders and soldiers near the trenches. But a lot of the innovation, or reforms, just gets choked up in the middle layers of leadership. So some leaders don't want to have some of that change or drive technical innovation because it creates more work for them. Some commanders just they have like a very rigid Soviet mentality where they're like, this is how the army has been. We're not going to integrate ground robots. It's like we're just going to keep sending humans on some of these missions because that's the army and that's how it's done. Whereas other younger, more entrepreneurial commanders, they're like very enthusiastic about trying, figuring out what works. They find a solution. They quickly call other unit commanders in the area, try to inform them, get lessons. And this is also where the work of volunteers comes in. So I visited numerous brigades with Dignitas Ukraine, headed by Luba Shapovich. And what I saw Luba doing was visiting different brigades, figuring out what their progress is with ground robotics, learning key problems that units are still facing, figuring out what like new technological innovations that they're driving, gathering these lessons and sharing them to different brigades, connecting different commanders with one another. So a lot of this innovation is just being driven at a grassroots level, and volunteers are helping connect some of those gaps. And the units are, trying to figure out ways of how do we work with one another. Because sometimes when it comes from the top down, it's certainly going to be delayed, and um, the getting more reforms in every part of the Ukrainian military is very important, not just to have the reforms, but to follow through and ensure that commanders are adapting these reforms.
And one of the impressions, and I tried to have as many conversations as I could at the Brave One. It's now open, so it's over rather. So, and most of the delegates have left the city, so I think it's safe to talk about it now for OPSEC. But quite a few people made the point that Western procurement systems are seeing things through the wrong lens. Possibly that applies to central government in Ukraine as well. But as you say, this is fundamentally driven by a tech entrepreneurial mindset and combined with the civic society mindset. But what several speakers, tried to get across to me is that if you think of drones as a product, and you think of a traditional sort of product ecosystem, it's going to fail because it has lead times, and you're trying to protect your IP, black box the systems, etc. It's simply going to fail because by the time you delivered this kit, it is going to be redundant before it hits the front. It may even be redundant before you start scaling up a manufacturing process. And then the equipment itself cannot be opened up. As a black box, it's not extensible, it's not flexible and adaptable. They, variously described it as a service or an ecosystem or even a process as opposed to a product. What's your impression of that and what it takes to succeed in drone warfare?
Yeah, I mean, the innovation and procurement slash countermeasure cycle, I think in the first year of the war, you typically could develop something and deploy it, and it'd give you, you'd be able to field it for probably like 6 months. And as the war has progressed, that cycle has been getting narrowed, and um, by 2025, from my understanding, it's about at a 6 week cycle, and probably by at this point in the year, it's probably even shorter now. Very often, the soldiers are giving like on daily calls with some of these like drone and ground robotics manufacturers, giving them feedback on what's working, what's not working. Sometimes they just get a very stripped down ground robot themselves, and across the front lines, you have soldiers just welding together different pieces and building out like the rest of the robotic complex itself, and then deploying it and like using that as its own like model that they're using on the front line. Um, and so if you're, there's also a cost dimension. So if you're using very expensive systems that are slow to procure, very expensive, it's not going to fare very well on the front line, because you need to be able to iterate, get feedback, and so if your time of development is very long, that's true. By the time you go and develop it and deploy to the battlefield, things have already changed. So when building for this type of warfare, that where unmanned systems are so dominant, there's a cost and there's a scale factor to it. So you need to be able to iterate, make changes, be able to quickly scale it, and have it at a cost-effective solution that it can be like widely deployed. Units can leverage it, and you also be able to incorporate feedback. It's not that I even heard from someone that it's not even necessarily that Western systems all perform badly on the battlefield in Ukraine from the start, but it's once they're deployed and they're being used, the Russians quickly find a way to adapt and deploy a countermeasure. So how fast can those like Western producers get that feedback, incorporate it, and then change things up? And I think that's where a lot of Western producers are going to struggle, because there's a dimension where many wonder if it's just, from the offset, that the Western systems are just not going to work at all. But plenty work is just being able to get that feedback within a matter of days or weeks, incorporate that within days, and then quickly bring it back and redeploy it so that it continues to be effective.
And that's fascinating. And I guess the Western product can't then be sort of hacked, either the hardware or the software in the field. You're reliant on a longer feedback loop, maybe with the manufacturer. Is it the case that Ukrainian systems are far more adaptable in the field by the specialists that need to be able to kind of hack them in a various kind of ways?
I think in general, yes. I mean, some of these organizations are led by ex-Ukrainian military, so they have a good understanding of, or they have people in their organization that are from the like ex-military, so they have a good understanding of what the need and urgency is on the front line, leveraging those connections to the units themselves, and like that constant iteration cycle of getting the feedback, making changes. Often some of these units or producers might get feedback from the units within like a day or two, and they're already working on like building those, incorporating those product feedback into the development, and then within days or a week, they can like redeploy it onto the battlefield and have it be effective again.
It's extraordinary. And the other, I think, interesting thing I heard, of course, is the attempts to try and preclude Chinese parts from the supply chain. That, of course, is a problem for Western supply chains as well, especially when certain components are taken into consideration, such as the sort of really, reliable mass-produced motors, which nonetheless are, very finely produced. I also heard, and I won't say who and in what context, but there have been cases of Chinese components potentially being kind of spiked as part of maybe an operation to reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian operations. How important is it that we actually have control over supply chains, control over components, control over how, I guess, the iteration cycle of those components?
Yeah, well, in the context of the war right now and just how important unmanned systems and technology is, um, I think that if China really wanted to, it can bring the war to a halt from both sides, based on how much it is supplying to Ukraine and Russia. I've heard uh, from Ukrainians. They even showed me some of their contacts and exchanges that they've had with Chinese producers, and they order from the same like fiber optic manufacturer in China that sells to both sides. I've certainly heard about some of the like Chinese um, fiber optic that has come in to be faulty and not as effective. Maybe some of that is attributed to a special operation from China where they're intentionally doing it, but it's increasingly unreliable. I've heard from someone else that now they're trying to source some of that fiber optic from India. Um, the Russians not only do a lot of their drones or most of their drones have Chinese engines, but up to 80% of the like critical components in the drones come from China. Um, the ballistic missiles, the parts, plenty of them also come from China. So the Russians are very reliant on the Chinese. The Ukrainians have saw this as an issue, and for the first few years of the war, it was relatively okay. But earlier this year, Zelensky said that that the Chinese began restricting the supply of Mavic drones to Ukraine. He mentioned that there are Chinese representatives overseeing manufacturing lines in Russia, helping the Russians. So now it's harder for the Ukrainians. They got to work with organizations throughout Europe and probably around the world to procure some of these Mavic drones, which are very important for conducting reconnaissance operations. And so both sides certainly have a very deep reliance on China. And Ukraine is trying to get itself off, and a lot of these components are now being produced and manufactured gradually over time in Ukraine. But of course, at some of the very lowest levels, a lot of these components or things that go into the components are still being sourced from China. So structurally, there's still going to be risks in the supply chain. Pivoting over to the West, a report that I read earlier this year, I think said that the US right now for drones probably has a reliance of up to 90% on China for the components that go into the drones or the drones themselves. So we can
In a
imagine,
direct confrontation with Russia, that's not necessarily a great position to be in.
right? And so if we think about what just happened in Poland, in Romania, and this is another aspect that I've been trying to cover recently, is just the how the economics of war have changed. Um, you have just very expensive fighter jets flying, chasing some of these uh, decoy drones that Russia deployed. Their cost can be anywhere from a couple thousand up to maybe $10,000. Estimates vary a bit for these decoy drones. And you have these fighter jets chasing or shooting down these decoy drones. They're using missiles that cost hundreds of thousands, and some of the other fighter jets have missiles worth millions. So if you're using something that's worth like $1 million to strike down something that's 10,000, and you do that at scale, if you think about when the Russians deploy 800 drones against Kiev and whatnot, do you deploy 800 of these very expensive missiles to shoot down 800 very cheap drones? And if that's being done every single day, and in the future, when the Russians scale their drone production even more, you're going to quickly run out of all your money trying to fight this war. I mean, Romania, those missiles that they wanted to use to shoot down the drones, I believe it was the Sidewinder missiles. But in any case, I read that they have less than 100 of them. So if they face the drone swarm of 800 in one night, they'd be able to shoot down less than 1/8 with those fighter jets. So it's not sustainable. You can't scale that. And of course, there's a lot of demand now for interceptors that Ukraine is building, but Ukraine is certainly struggling with just scaling production of those interceptors. Training takes time, so it's not like you build a solution, you quickly deploy it. It's going to take time, and the Russians are building countermeasures within their drones. So some of their drones have been found with NVIDIA chips and potentially machine learning capabilities. So if an interceptor is coming and it detects it, it starts doing all sorts of evasive maneuvers, and then it's hard to hit it directly. So even in the sky, there's a very quick countermeasure race going on, and both sides, like every day, are trying to adapt and find tactics that work. So there's not just one quick solution that you can get and quickly deploy. It's a constant tech race. And so if that is being applied over the Asia Pacific, and the Chinese are just launching swarms of thousands and thousands of drones, it's like, how is the West going to counter that, or the US is going to counter that? Maybe we do build a fleet of drone interceptors and cheap drones ourselves to counter that, but then the Chinese quickly cut off the supply. And if the supply chain is not resilient or we don't de-risk it, it's just like, how are we going to deal with that? And these drones are flying over and hitting some of the airfields. That cost asymmetry is just going to be really, really difficult to overcome. And military planners, I think, are growing increasingly aware of this, but it sometimes takes these bursts of events. First, you have Ukraine's general military effort, where it's, drones have this drone wall that Ukraine has formed, has allowed it to keep fighting for this long. You have Operation Spiderweb, where those drones and trolleys were used to destroy numerous Russian strategic bombers. And then, of course, now you have the Russians using these drones to harass NATO airspace.
That's an interesting one because I was gonna follow up on that. I've again had a few conversations around why Russia launched that, and I think it's clear to most that it's a testing exercise to measure a variety of things. But I'm interested in two things. What is your perception of what Russia was strategically trying to get out of that? And secondly, how does that inform their next steps? Because, of course, if they were to send kamikaze drones with explosives into European cities, that's maybe jumping a few escalatory steps, which might, wake us up, as it were, to action, or to arm Ukraine to take out those logistic sites that launch or manufacture the drones. What is likely to be Russia's next escalatory step? Could it be, for instance, trying to shut down the British and European civilian airspace and incur vast economic losses without necessarily, going for a full kinetic strike?
Yeah. I think you touch on, it's a good segue into, I think, what Russia's broader strategy is in general with the confrontation of NATO. I don't think Russia at any point wants a direct military confrontation with all of NATO itself, but of course it wants to continue employing its hybrid warfare, testing NATO, seeing where NATO stands. Is NATO actually willing to go to war with Russia if it does some of these incursions? If you have a Crimea style campaign where you send green men into the Suwalki Gap or Estonia, or the French or the Brits, are the Germans willing to go to war with Russia here? Are they prepared to go to war? And so the idea is to keep increasing the stakes so that the Europeans each time back down, and that Russia can avoid a direct conventional war with NATO. So you can keep testing the boundaries going up the escalation ladder, and then you keep getting more and more out of the Europeans in terms of them not willing to do anything to stop Russia. And so Russia feels like it's only being emboldened and it can continue to take more action, both against Ukraine and Europe. And then I think you also have the political factor across Europe coming into play, which the Kremlin is watching, whether that's the elections in France, in Czech Republic. Czech Republic has been giving a lot of ammunition and helping with the artillery shell procurement for Ukraine. And now you might have, an anti-Ukraine candidate win in the upcoming election. You had a very close call in Romania. You had, it still remains to be seen, but maybe these, less pro-Ukrainian candidate win there. So you have certainly, and UK has its own, domestic politics going on right now. So you just have this political turbulence going across all of Europe. And Ukraine itself is going to have a financial crisis in the coming years if Europe doesn't step up the financial support. A lot of the current budgets were forecasted to last through the end of 2025, and leaders thought there would be a peace settlement when they were doing some of that financial forecasting. In reality, Ukraine is going to need a lot more help from Europe to plug in some of these budgets to continue financing Ukraine as a continuous financing and just keep the government and a lot of the war effort running. So Europe is going to face not only challenges in rearming itself, but in continuing to help finance, Ukraine's functioning into the future. And I think a problem with a lot of these European countries is or political dynamics is some of the Europeans are like, well, we have problems at home. If this is an impossible war to win, why should we keep helping Ukraine? Maybe we should just give up and then move on with their lives. And so, the Russians are very skillful at getting in to these European countries, exploiting the political dynamics and weaponizing support for Ukraine. And that's one aspect that's in play. The other is that the Russians believe that if they're betting on mass in Ukraine, and we see that with just the ever increasing amount of drones that they're sending into Ukraine. So Ukraine is very short on air defense, traditional air defenses, just to even hit ballistic missiles. Ukraine is certainly in a race to try to scale interceptors and other methods of shooting down these drones. But I talked to one Ukrainian lawmaker, Sasha Ustanova from the Holos Party. She told me that she's very worried that in about a year, they're going to need to put netting over cities to protect against the growing reach of these drones. And so just like Ukrainian soldiers are reliant on putting some of these nets and wooden posts on the front line, Ukrainian
It's
cities...
frontline, isn't it, at the moment? So the depth, I guess, would be what, sort of 30 to 50 kilometers now at the moment. But you're talking about hundreds of kilometers maybe needing, to be secured.
Yeah, and I mean, Maria Berlinska from the Victory Drones project is also already talking about how Europe and Ukraine need to partner of how to collectively protect their cities from these massive swarms of soon-to-be autonomous cheap drones flying over and hitting the cities. And so, I don't think people are just realizing how bad it's going to get when, the Russians and the Chinese are able to build these swarms of drones. And this message is also, not only are the Europeans scrambling to try to buy Ukrainian drone interceptors, but I think a lot more people across Europe or leaders are going to think, yeah, deep down, I want to help Ukraine. But if the Russians are actually stepping up their attacks across Europe and just sending these drones, I need my air defenses for myself. So I think there's a worry in Ukraine that now the Europeans are actually going to give in to Putin and not be as willing to give air defenses to Ukraine. And so I think Putin's looking at all of this, the indecisiveness of Europe, the ability to put pressure on Ukraine. Putin thinks he's winning and he wants to keep applying pressure like this. And so if he sees that there's no adequate response to his escalation and he sees that he can get away with this, I think certainly if Putin doesn't get what he wants and keeps demanding, say, just the capitulation of Ukraine, he's only going to keep increasing the going higher on the escalation ladder. And some of his motivation is also domestic as the economic situation in the country becomes worse, as like societal pressures, whether that's the discontent with the population, inflation rising, and the economy overheating, the fact that they need to keep increasing the bonuses that they're paying. There's labor shortages. There's a lot of problematic economic indicators in Russia. And so what do dictators do when they have problems like that? They grow increasingly, their rhetoric grows more hostile, and they look to do wage bigger wars to try to distract their population from all the problems at home. So you just have a few of these variables all working together to inform the Kremlin's approach, and certainly Europe's, cowardly approach over the last few years. I mean, we have the Polish foreign minister talking about, fly zone over Ukraine. We were at that point in 2022. Like we're far past that. And logistically, that is going to be very, very complex. Okay. Are the Europeans again going to use fighter jets with very expensive missiles to shoot down cheap drones over Ukraine? That's not scalable. I don't even think that's feasible to do. They're going to quickly run out of all their missiles and money very fast. What is scalable and what should have been done years ago is giving Ukraine long-range missiles and hitting the drone factories themselves. There was an article from a Ukrainian news outlet, and from what they analyzed, Ukraine was able, in the month of August, from all their drone strikes on the Russian factories that produced these Shahed drones, they were able to bring down Russia's waves of Shaheds by a third throughout August. So if Ukraine is using long-range drones effectively alone to hit these factories and reduce Russia's output in storage, I can only imagine the damage that they can do to reduce Russia's output with getting missiles to just hit these warehouses and factories so that Russia can't even bring the drones near the front line to deploy them. So the right response from Europe should have been giving Ukraine missiles and more weaponry to be able to just not strike the arrow but hit the archer directly. And I think this tactic of punching Putin in the face works very well. Turkey demonstrated it back in, I believe it was 2015, when they shut down
Right.
the Russian fighter jet, and again the Kremlin was quite speechless. And when Dmitry Medvedev and the Kremlin said they were going to unleash Armageddon in, what was it, October 2022, if they hit the Crimean bridge, which they did, and then they used storm shadows to hit the occupied Crimea, and the Kremlin was silent each time. So, the right answer should have been a strong response, punch Putin in the face so that he quickly learns his lesson and doesn't go and start harassing Europe with drones.
And the sight of Storm Shadow's scalp taking out the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, I mean, that should have really convinced everyone that really Russia's red lines don't count for anything. But of course, with every bold step, there seems to become a retrenchment or return to timidity or so-called escalation management.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it pushed Ukraine into pretty desperate measures. I mean, the whole Kursk offensive going into Russia itself. I think if I remember reading one of the articles when Biden was briefed in the White House, in the Oval Office, when he had to see imagery of American tanks. And I believe that Ukrainians didn't ask for proper permission. They just rolled into Kursk. And then the Biden administration was horrified that they were watching the Ukrainians using that American equipment to roll into Kursk.
World War
then,
III, and yeah, not really.
Yeah. I mean, it was a pretty, of course, I think logistically, it would have been nice if Ukraine came in, you know, hand gave the Russians, you know, a heavy attritional fight in terms of allowing the Russians to send reinforcements, and uh, killed a lot of those waves of Russian soldiers from the first initial weeks when they had a good position. But then, staying there for 7 months, um, or 6+ months, and then having the Russians redeploy a lot of their best units to the area. Then the Russians at that time also were the first to widely deploy fiber optics. So there's this thinking that, okay, like we're hopping through the unmanned system stages. Soon there's going to be AI and it's going to proliferate. That proved much harder to build. And so we kind of went backwards, and just in terms of a more simpler solution, just attaching wires and it's a reflection of how Russia has learned from mistakes in the war. The Russians scaled down. They used fiber optics they attacked Ukraine from the flanks, collapsed the flanks. They narrowed the supply route into the front line, and they were just hitting the Ukrainians. And a lot of these soldiers had to retreat by foot. And, Ukraine should have never been in a situation, but it was forced to, because it was trying to show that, like, these red lines are so illusionary. Give us what we need to fight. It was a plea, a call for help, but if and it's difficult to watch us go like full cycle of, we started the war, there were pleas for a no-fly zone, and then it's like this happens here, we're kind of like back full stop at the cycle, like we should create a fly zone. But the reality is, it's like, I feel like everyone's beating around the bush, but everyone knows what should be done, what should have been done in 2022, but nobody's taking those steps, and it's just going to prolong the war. And it's Russia's an empire. Empires don't just stop; they need to expand. The very foundation or existence of Russia itself is a lie from the Muscovy, and the lie that they're the heir to the Kievan Rus state. They use that as a lie to invade its neighbors and wage a war. And so Russia, that was based on a lie, used that lie to expand its war, and that's what it's done throughout its history. There's just no point in which, like, Russia understands that I'm just going to stay within my borders and be happy with that. If you give dictators a peace, they're always going to come back for more. So it just, are we not naive to history, or are we just so constrained by domestic politics, which the Russians are so skillful at influencing? So the challenge is very difficult. Ukraine, is in a race to deploy more and more technology to try to save more human lives across the front. But, you have a very heavy attritional battle from both sides, leveraging drones. And the longer that the war goes on, the more that the Russians are learning from the war, the better that they're getting. And, with time, they're learning lessons. They're scaling those lessons very effectively. And now it's not just a matter of do you have good technology and are you using it effectively, but are you able to forecast what's coming and to prepare for that? Again, the Russians were the first to like massively scale fiber optics across the front. They were able to see that and scale it. And you have now, back from 2024, they appointed a defense minister to run economist to run the defense ministry.
A nice Soviet apparatchik.
Right. But I mean, the idea was to streamline a lot of bureaucracy and make it more efficient. So again, the longer that the war goes on, even though it took the Russians a long time, they're going to be able to scale some of these solutions. They're increasingly being backed by China, North Korea. North Koreans are supplying about 40% of their ammunition needs, and artillery. More and more Chinese components are being found in, these Russian drones and missiles. The Iranians helped the Russians build the initial Shahid factories. Now you have Iran sending some of these like Shahid style drones to Venezuela. So, if MAGA thinks that this war is not interconnected and the axis of evil is not expanding their technological cooperation with one another, I think sooner or later, all powers will learn that, events in Ukraine are far more interconnected than they'd like to believe. The North Koreans are getting Shahed, kamikaze drones from the Russians. They're getting, supposedly very secretive technologies in exchange for helping the Russians. I mean, just this technological cooperation is growing. The Russians are learning the lessons. They're being exchanged with one another. And these powers that the West will likely find itself fighting against around the world in the future are working together, conspiring against the West. And it's very dangerous that they're learning and sharing these lessons with one another. So, just my plea is, to all political actors that this war is just far, far more interconnected, and it's all ties back together. And history doesn't happen in isolation. It all works together.
That's a very important point, and I think it would be good to have a future conversation to dig into the interaction between kinetic warfare and informational, because I think that's going to play a key role in their so-called hybrid operations against Europe. For today, though, there's so much fantastic information and insight in this episode. I'm very grateful to you for sort of dialing in to record this for the audience. Thank you so much for everything you do, the risks you take. They are, I think, extraordinarily important, even if not everyone in Europe quite realizes that yet. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.